where we are trying to explore some of the really important issues that have come up as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and the situation that so many people in our community find ourselves in. As you know, Paperweight is a wonderful charity run by Bela Perrin and Benji Conway, and they have done so much marvelous work in supporting some of the vulnerable people in our community, but also now just helping be a kind of social services for our community. So tonight's webinar is about money and rights and support that you can perhaps find across the country or within the community. And we have three fantastic experts for you tonight. First, if I introduce Louise Aarons. She is a partner in the international law firm Withers, LLP, and she specializes in employment and partnership advice. She's a leader, acknowledged leader in her field, and she'll be answering any of your questions on redundancy or employment, protecting yourselves, and also if you're an employer of what your rights and obligations might be at this time. Then we have Malcolm Cohen, who is a partner at BDO, the Chartered Accountants, and a licensed insolvency practitioner with over 30 years experience in business restructuring and insolvency. And he can answer any questions that you might have about, sadly, the situation that some businesses and directors are finding themselves in with companies in distress and how to navigate that in these difficult times. He's also answering questions on COVID, a guide to the perplexed, and wanted me to tell you that he's a star footballer as well. Oh, no. And Rabbi Nicky Liss, who is our third panelist this evening, chair of the United Synagogue Rabbinical Council and also Rabbi of Highgate Shul, an experienced and much admired rabbinic leader. He will describe how COVID-19 has affected the community and our rabbis and what kind of issues they will be grappling with. So before we go to the questions, firstly, I'd like to ask all of you here who are watching this evening, welcome to the webinar. And if you want to ask us questions, please send them in, although we do already have a number of questions for our panelists that have been sent in advance. So please feel free to ask your questions, send them in. And of course, feel free to support Paperweight at any time. I have to get that plug in. We really do need your help. There's so much extra work. Before coming to questions, may I please ask you, Rabbi Liss, to speak for a few minutes about your experiences of what's been happening within our community at this time of crisis for our country, and indeed with a global pandemic for other countries as well. If you wouldn't mind just saying a few words of introduction for us, I think that would set the evening really nicely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ros, for that introduction, and it's a real privilege to be on a panel with such esteemed panelists, with Elaine and with Malcolm. By way of introduction, I want to point out that one of the many reasons that we read the book of Ruth on Shavuos is because it's a book of chesed, a book of loving kindness, which indicates that the type of society that we should be building upon accepting the Torah is one based on chesed. This week, coincidentally, is also National Volunteers Week. So with both of those thoughts in mind, I'd like to thank Paperweight and all of its volunteers for the incredible chesed and the really important and amazing service that it provides the community. I think it's fair to say, and real apologies for the cliche, that the time that we've experienced since Purim has been truly unprecedented. We've had to close shuls. In the shuls, we've had to switch to online provision, care for the community, and at the outset, help everyone prepare for Pesach. At the same time, while those people in communities, whether it was rabbinic leaders or others, had to maintain their own homes, and in many cases, they or their family members were ill with the virus. The number of patiras, of people passing away, was truly shocking. And when we do come out of this, however relieving it's going to be for us all, we cannot and must not forget all those who have suffered. And people have suffered financially as well, with so much doubt around the future, whether it's their own financial position, whether it's the position of their jobs. And I think I get a sense, and I've checked this with colleagues as well, that we're in sort of a false phase at the moment. If we think of there being three phases, as a member helpfully helped me put it, there's the react, there's the respond, and then there's the reset phase. The react phase, the community, across the community, people were outstanding in the way they gathered together to help people, to suddenly tap into resources, to get people to prepare for Pesach, to look after the elderly and the more vulnerable in the community. I think we're now in the respond phase and getting ready for the reset phase when life starts again. And it's sort of like we're in no man's land and people aren't sure of their financial positions yet. And so it's critical that organizations and at the forefront, paperweight, are there to be able to answer people's questions and to be there on hand at the end of a phone call to be able to guide people through this. I think that's enough for my introductory words. Perhaps I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it's important to take questions, but I hope that sets the tone.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Liss. And I'd just like to echo your words of congratulations to all the wonderful volunteers at Paperweight and all the amazing work that Paperweight and so many volunteers across the community are doing right now. And the concept of chesed, which is so much part of all the work that is being done. So let me, if I may, now just turn to a few of the questions that we have already had in. And can I ask you first, Elaine, a question that we've had, and I'll read it out. I have been employed full-time in administration in a school. I am over 70 with medical conditions and have been working from home since mid-March. 1, can my employer cut my hours if there isn't enough work which I can do from home? And 2, can my employer insist on me coming into work if they say that they have secure working conditions? Elaine?
One of the problems with this whole area is there is so much law around it, and I could spend the whole of the next half an hour answering those 2 questions, but let me try and be very succinct. In terms of cutting hours, whether you're over 70, under 70, with medical conditions, without medical conditions, it's a minefield for employers and something to be dealt with very carefully indeed. My advice to employers would be, unless you need to do it at this stage for your financial survival, it's quite likely going to be more hazardous than it's worth whilst the furlough scheme is still running, because you're going to be partly funded by that scheme. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, this particular questioner is over 70, so they've got age discrimination rights. They've got underlying medical conditions, which may mean that they are disabled under the disability discrimination legislation. If that weren't enough, the law is very stacked against employers changing terms and conditions. There is a way of doing it, but it's quite hazardous to achieve. The first thing you can do as an employer is ask the individual to agree to the change in terms and conditions. And maybe they will, but maybe they won't. If they don't, then imposing the change on the employee is disastrous and not something any employer should do. It would just lead to legal claims. The technically right way of doing it is to consult, to, if the individual won't agree, dismiss on the basis that you, as the employer, will re-engage on the varied terms. But you can imagine the process of doing that and it being reasonable, the process of ensuring that it's not seen as discriminatory. If the individual has a disability, you have to think about what adjustments you need to make for that disability. It's just a minefield. So my advice to employers would be, try not to do it for now if you can avoid it.
If the employee, though, is frightened to go into work and the employer says, it's safe and I've got secure working conditions for you, and then the employee says, I am frightened to go in, can the employer insist?
So if the employee has reasonable grounds for saying that the workplace is dangerous, they have protection from the law. If they think that the workplace presents a serious and imminent threat to their health, they have protection from health and safety law. And if they just think it's dangerous, but not as serious as serious and imminent threat, which I think COVID would be, I think COVID would be a serious and imminent threat to health if proper precautions aren't taken. But if they think it's dangerous, they may have the protection of whistleblowing law as well. So there's quite a lot to protect the employee, but the employee has to have a reasonable basis for it. So if the employers introduce social distancing, if the individual can get to and from work safely, if they're not living with somebody who's extremely critically vulnerable, all of which gets taken into account. Your journey to work, who you live with, and the workplace all gets taken into account. But if the employer's covered everything off and made sure they've made reasonable adjustments for any disabilities, then the individual really ought to go to work.
Because I'm hearing that a number of companies are saying they will not employ over 70s who they have previously employed, because regardless of their health, you know, even if they're fit and healthy, because the government guidelines suggest that over 70s are clinically vulnerable. They're not extremely vulnerable, but vulnerable.
Yes, so they are classified as vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that they're not able to work. The classification was regardless of your health. So you could be a sprightly 70-year-old able to put in a 12-hour day, but just because you happen to be of that age, you'd be counted as vulnerable. But you're not really vulnerable at all. So each case will depend on its own facts. And if you had a policy of not taking anybody over the age of 70, that falls under the category of direct discrimination on grounds of age, and there's no defence to direct discrimination, so it's pretty serious.
Even in the current environment with the emergency
there is no
legislation.
defence to direct discrimination of any sort in any circumstance.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else want to come in on that, or shall we move on to other questions? Malcolm?
Yeah.
A question for you. Is there any advice or top tips that you can give to company directors looking to keep their business afloat in these difficult times?
Thank you, Ros, and good evening, everybody. Also, I'd like to obviously pay tribute to Paperweight and all they do and all their volunteers. Thank you very much. So, top tips. It's a very difficult question, and I could keep you here for half an hour on this, but I'll be brief and pick up perhaps 5 main areas where I think directors should focus to make sure that their business does stay afloat. It's crucial, obviously, to have business plans, contingency plans, have proper financial projections, cash flow forecasts, budgets. All that's going to stand you in good stead going forward. And then, in addition, of course, look for the mortgage holidays, the business rate holidays, and obviously any benefits you can reap from the furlough scheme. And think about how long it's going to take to recover post-COVID. There's one thing, navigating through COVID, but when you come out the other side, how's the company going to pay back the loans to the government? I mean, they are loans. People shouldn't forget that. They're not freebies. They need to be repaid. You'll have to think about other ways, perhaps, of fundraising. And of course, when your staff return, don't do it all at once, but perhaps a phased return of staff based on the revenues. And if you see them increasing, then you'll increase the phasing back of staff. Secondly, look at your supply chain. Has the company an over-reliance on one supplier, perhaps based in a particular location that's been very badly hit by COVID? Dare I say, you know, Chinese suppliers, are they going to be able to continue to supply? Look at the terms of contracts, who's got responsibility for delivery, who bears the exchange risk, and of course, sadly, what happens in an insolvency situation. Thirdly, I would very much advise to home in on the art of communication. Regular contact with key suppliers, absolutely crucial. Will they be able to fulfill contracts? Will they be able to fill them in a timely fashion? And maybe are they prepared even for a second, dare we say it, a second COVID spike? And of course, communication with staff is absolutely paramount in very stressful situations. Staff want to know what's going on. Fourthly, products and service suitability. Have customer behaviors and customer preferences altered so much, perhaps altered forever? And therefore, does the company need to change its product or the way it delivers its service? Do you need to change price structure? And then finally, leadership style. Very, very important in times of stress for you as directors. Perhaps the all hands on deck approach won't work here. When you're addressing, giving your staff guidance and leadership, the messages must be simple, they've got to be credible, they've got to be consistent, and those messages need to be regularly reinforced. And similarly with your creditors, you must be open and honest. Yes, of course, explore things like installment payments. We know that the revenue, for example, are being very, very benevolent, entering into time to pay agreements, giving companies up to 12 months time for companies to pay historical liabilities with no penalties. You will need to provide cash flows to them and proof of long-term business viability, but these things are out there, and the government is trying to help. So, in conclusion, really, in those I've given you 5 tips. I would say that companies that understand their reason to exist, and they use what I would call forward-looking indicators to track progress, they will usually outperform, and they will be the ones that survive. Find the right people with the right skills and make sure you focus them on the critical tasks.
Thank you, Malcolm. So when you are given a holiday from paying some of your tax bills at the moment, or VAT, what you're saying is there are no penalties and no interest on the late payment, yes?
Yes, that is right. But they will need to be paid back.
Yeah.
And you will need supporting documentation to be able to demonstrate that the business is viable and will come out the other side. But yes, the government is really trying to help as much as it can.
Yeah, and one of the audience has sent in a comment saying that following what you've been explaining, the FSB, Federation of Small Business website, is very clear and concise. So if people wanted to refer to that, that might also be helpful for what would be available.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a plethora of information on the web, and yeah, it's very easy these days through Google just to look. There are some amazing and very concise and helpful advice out there on the web. Yeah.
Thank you. If I go back to you for a moment, Elaine, if I may, we've had lots of questions on the employment side from both the employer and employee perspective. One that we might touch on, if that's okay, is what the options are for both the employee and the employer if you are a worker and you refuse to accept an extension of furlough.
I think that what that question means, if I'm reading between the lines, is that this is an employee who's agreed to go on furlough at 80% of their salary.
Yeah.
Because you can be furloughed on 100% of your salary, with the government paying 80% and the employer topping you up. But the tone of the question suggests that the individual's had enough of being on 80% and doesn't want to agree to that any longer. And I think what the question means is that they've signed a furlough letter which was for a period of time which is now about to expire, and do they have to agree to be furloughed at 80% for longer? And the furlough scheme at the end of the day was designed to save jobs that would otherwise be made redundant. And so employees need to look quite realistically at what the consequences would be if they didn't agree to continue to be furloughed. When you're furloughed as well, you absolutely, at the moment, can't do any work at all. That's going to change in August. But at the moment, you can't do any work at all. It may be this individual's just bored and wants to get back to work. I think the answer is that you can refuse to sign a further furlough letter, but you put your job at risk if you do.
Yeah, the employer can then ask you to leave, basically.
Exactly, the employer, and the employer doesn't have to demonstrate that the reason that they're asking you to leave is because if they didn't, they would go under. It doesn't have to be something that they do to just save the business from extinction. It can just be a sound business reason that, all things being equal, they can't pay people 100% at the moment, and they need to make some redundancies. However, the employer would have to go through a fair redundancy selection process, a fair consultation process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who doesn't want to accept extension of furlough is the one that's going to be made redundant. It could end up being someone else.
Right. Okay. And related to that, if you've got an employee who's in a vulnerable category and therefore can't come to work, and you've been paying them full pay rather than putting them on furlough, how long do you need to pay them full pay before one would say you can let them go if they can't actually come to work and be socially distanced and can't do the work satisfactorily from home?
It's very difficult because at the moment, I think all the sympathy is lying with the employees, but there comes a point at which this is the same as any long-term sickness absence. And there's a process of consultation, a need for medical advice as to whether this person can be rehabilitated into their job and what it would require and what it would take. The only thing keeping them away from work is COVID. Then there's going to be an issue about how long it's likely to be that they're not going to be able to work and a medical prognosis of that. If the fact is that, I mean, the people who are extremely clinically vulnerable, many of them are very seriously ill anyway. And if they're not likely to be able to come back to work as it is, that's a problem employers have, whether COVID is in the picture or not, about at what point do you have the right to say to somebody, we've taken this as far as we can, and it's with great regret, but we've reached the stage we can't keep employing you. So the answer, bottom line, is get as much information about the medical condition, think about it in the context of how long is COVID likely to continue, and how is there any prospect that this individual will come back to work once the immediate threat and danger has passed. And if not, there will come a point at which employers can dismiss.
Yeah, so the employer, if they can't offer us a safe environment in this COVID environment, they would eventually be able to ask them to leave, unfortunately.
Yes, they would. One rule of thumb which may be useful is that for employers who have more generous sick pay provisions, some employers will continue to pay for 3 or 6 months. It's generally regarded as dangerous to dismiss somebody before they've expired their sick pay entitlement.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you. Maybe I can ask to all the panelists, if this carries on, and we know that charities are obviously suffering, and small businesses too, do you expect that the businesses will lay off those who are now on furlough because they need to cut costs, given what you know about the coming changes to the furlough scheme and the implication for employers? And will they therefore have to go through redundancy packages?
Do you want me to pick that one up first?
Malcolm or Elaine, either, or Rabbi Liss, if you have any comments as well.
I mean, from my point of view, I mean, I think the answer is, unfortunately and sadly, obvious. I think, leaving aside the technical side of it, I mean, companies that aren't viable and that are existing purely, because of the, as I said, the beneficence of the government, allowing employees to stay on within companies under the furlough scheme, when perhaps the demand for the product of the company or whatever, or the service, has fallen away. I mean, inevitably, once the furlough scheme reduces and is withdrawn completely come October, I'm afraid to say, I don't want to be a doom and gloom merchant, but I think that there's going to be a lot of pain, I'm afraid, particularly on the high street and generally across businesses, and which won't support employment. And
what about charities?
Well, I think charities have suffered, I think, probably in that as a category of businesses and enterprises. Really, the government has almost virtually overlooked charities in granting them loans and support. The various bounce back schemes and C-bills, and they don't really apply to the charities, who rely on effectively donations coming in, and obviously with people's incomes being hit, donations are the first thing that will fall away. So inevitably, I think charities are no different. If they have got staff, they will need to consider very carefully whether they can continue managing that complement of staff.
Rabbi Liss, can I just ask if you've been approached by any congregants who have been working for charities, and what their concerns are, and anything that you feel religiously or communally you've been able to help with, pointing to Jewish Care or High Cancer Care or Jamie. We've got some wonderful charities, and I just wondered how you cope with congregants, and if you've got any thoughts as well that you can share with us that would be helpful to our audience, please.
Thank you for that, Ros. Following on from what Malcolm said, I think those members I've spoken to, and also colleagues that I've spoken to about this as well, and as I alluded to a little bit earlier on, I think we all feel like we're in a bit of no man's land at the moment, that the difficulties are coming, and we have to be aware of that. The charities you mentioned, we have people working for Jewish Care, for Jamie, are doing incredible stuff at the moment, but it's also people are tapping into schemes like the furlough scheme, but when that comes to an end, the question is where we're going to be, and that is unknown. But I think people are somewhat realistic that when those schemes are taken away, and it's a great chesed from the government that they've provided it, that things will need to change. What I think is something very important, I've been following a retired oncologist online and seeing his comments. His name is Professor Carol Sikora.
Yes.
Who talks about the importance of avoiding chronic stress. And he says that he's been treating cancer patients for his whole adult life. And he says you learn the hard way how important hope can be, and that fear and panic achieve nothing, will only make our situation worse. And he's also quite positive that this summer will feel a lot more normal than people think. We were in a very dark place in March, but look how far we've come in that short time. And so I think it's important to be realistic. And another person I like to quote, a fellow called Simon Sinek, who's an amazing leadership guru, that he talks about the difference between optimistic and being positive. So optimism is not the denial of reality. Positivity is about saying that things are good even when they're not. We don't need that right now. So for rabbis or anyone to come out and say, oh, everything's going to be fine, that's unhelpful. But as he puts it, and I think this fits very much with our our Jewish beliefs, that optimism is the belief that the future can be positive. We're going through a tough time, but we'll get through them together. Not the denial of what is, but a fundamental belief that things will be good, and we are heading towards that light. And if I could just finish this part with what my father often says to me. We say in davening every morning, and actually now has been a time when we're not, unfortunately we haven't had minyanim, but it gives us a little bit more time to spend on the davening. And in Pesukei to Zimra, in one of the Halalukas we say between Ashrei and Yishtabach, we say the verse, we say Harefe l'shfurei leiv v'machabesh latzavosam, referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, someone who heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Let's never forget we have a Ribbono Shalom, we have HaKadosh Baruch who's there for us to turn to. Things are challenging. Naturally, things will possibly get worse with the furloughing scheme taken away, but things can improve as well, and we need to rely on Hashem, but also turn to the organizations. I've mentioned Paperweight before, mention them again. Speak to people who are experts in this field, as following on from Malcolm as well, make sure our CVs are up to scratch, and perhaps tap into some of the our untapped skills that we have, and the various things online you can do to test what your skills are, and see how we can develop ourselves during this time.
Thank you so much for those inspiring and uplifting thoughts. That was wonderful.
Ros, I've just seen. Sorry, I'm not sure whether you're going to move on. I've just seen on the questions from the floor, so to speak. Some be quite rightly pointed out that the government has proffered a 700. Oh, sorry. The 750 million package is available for charities, but I think the devil is in the detail. It says working in the frontline areas, re the COVID response. Now, quite what the definition of frontline is, I'm not sure, but I doubt.
Health and social care.
Yeah. So it's not going to cover our perhaps known and well loved local charities, and particularly I don't think it counts for our Jewish schools, for example. That is a difficult area.
What I think is so wonderful for our community is the amazing charities that we do have. Obviously, we have Paperweight who've organised this tonight, but if you need business support and information, or you need to find work if you don't have your job anymore, we've got Work Avenue, which does amazing things for people already, and Jewish Care, Jamie, High Cancer Care. Our community has got so much support for people during difficult times. So, I think we can be really thankful about that. If I can just go on to a few other questions. We've had a very sad question from somebody who is listening. The person was 72 years old, stopped work at the end of March because of lockdown, and then unfortunately passed away from COVID-19. And the question is, what could the estate claim from the employer, if anything? Their final payday before they passed away was the 31st of March this year. I wonder, Elaine, if you might be able to help on that one.
Having listened to Rabbi Liss's very inspiring words, I sort of feel this is, as you say, a very sad question to be answering, and I'm not sure I've got an answer that's going to provide a lot of comfort. I would say that in the absence of life insurance that goes with the job, and no mention is made of that here, obviously if there was life insurance, you would look to that.
That's the first thing to check.
Sorry?
That would be the first thing to check.
Yeah. But in the absence of life insurance, death is regarded as what the lawyers somewhat dispassionately call a frustrating event, which is a rather unfortunate way of describing it. But it means that it's an event which brings the contract to an end naturally without the notice period in the contract.
Oh, right.
There are very few events which are described as frustrating events. and therefore the individual be entitled to be paid up to the date that they passed away. Assuming, well, there may be issues of sick pay if they were off sick for a while and what they were entitled to. There may be furlough questions as to what they were entitled to, but it would be up to the date of death unless the employer wanted to do something more generous than that.
Okay, a question for Malcolm. Again, I've heard that the government is fast-tracking new insolvency legislation through Parliament to help businesses. What are the most important features of this legislation? And at the same time, maybe I could ask you to give some thoughts on a company which says it can't survive. It's made that decision. So what does it need to do now? Is it best to file for administration or look for a company voluntary arrangement or liquidation? And does this legislation affect that in any way?
Thank you, Ros. Again, as I said earlier on, the government is really bending over backwards to try and make sure that there are businesses that are surviving once we come out of this awful mess. And amazingly, when the government wants to move, it really can move. Legislation normally takes years to get through Parliament, first reading, second reading. But the first reading of the bill was only introduced a couple of weeks ago. The second reading is taking place, in fact, later this week, and they expect legislation to be passed by the end of the month. And this legislation is all really focused on helping businesses and companies. And there are one or two sort of personal quirks as well. It's impossible to talk about the whole bill. I'll try and pick up sort of three particular areas that I think are very important. And the first will affect really everybody. And the government has restricted the ability of creditors to be able to wind up a company. So that's one of the ways, if you're owed money, you can normally look to attack a company and put it into liquidation. Now, the government has severely restricted that. And it said that no statutory demands or winding up petitions can be brought against a company for the moment up until the 1st of July. So nothing can happen certainly to the end of this month. And I suspect the government, once the legislation is finalized, will probably extend that date. So that's going to be very helpful to companies. Again, the downside to that is that whenever that period ends, that sort of moratorium period, whenever it ends, again, the debt won't disappear. The debt will still be there, and any historical liabilities will need to be repaid. But again, it will give a breathing space to companies. Surprisingly, no similar breathing space has been given for individuals. So bankruptcies can still be forced through. That's a surprising omission there. So that's one of the things. Again, until the 1st of July, there's also been a temporary suspension of directors' liability for wrongful trading, which is often a concept that directors run scared of. But so in theory, a director can try and carry on trading his company to try and trade out of this mess without the worry of possible potential personal liability for worsening the position of creditors as a result of the company carrying on to trade.
Thank you.
So that's again a measure that certainly should relax directors. They still, of course, must be mindful of their general duties, their general fiduciary duties, but at least the wrongful trading one will help.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if they're deliberately defrauding creditors, then
yes, if they're deliberately defrauding creditors, that's certainly not going to work.
Yeah, thank you. So we're running out of time, but I hope everyone out there wouldn't mind if we perhaps overrun a little bit by a few minutes, maybe an extra 10 minutes or so, because we still got quite a few questions and we haven't got through them all. I hope that's
Ros,
okay.
can I chip in based on what Malcolm just said? I just want to make a point. It's not meant to be a party political broadcast. It's a statement as a lawyer. But what Malcolm's been talking about, what I've been talking about, is legislation that has been rushed through to help people. The kind of legislation that normally would take 2 years to get onto the statute book has taken, in some cases, 2 weeks.
I know, I've seen it myself.
Yeah,
yes,
amazing.
It's amazing, and for all the criticisms of the government in so many different ways, as the people at the sharp end of this legislation, I think we have to recognise that that's what they've done, and it's been a great help to people.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Thank you. I mean,
Yep.
it is quite unprecedented, and the government has got a monumental task, and is just acting in a really rapid way, in ways that you would never have imagined were possible a few months ago. So
Will Boris be sent a recording of this presentation? I think he'll be chuffed, I think.
okay, Rabbi Liss, I just wonder if you have any more uplifting thoughts for us. I mean, obviously the lockdown has created dreadful emotional strains on all of us and our families, with homeschooling and kids at home who want to not be at home. Any advice on diffusing tensions or easing some of the depression that people will feel when they just think, oh my goodness, I may lose my job, etc., etc.?
Big questions, and really valid and important ones as well. I can't stress enough the importance of speaking to someone. So on behalf of the rabbinic fraternity, or whether it's your local rabbi or rebbitzin, know that you've got someone to turn to, who you can speak to in confidence. I should point out, should caveat that that's for support. Rabbis and rebbitzins are probably not experts in some of these fields that you're asking for questions in, but they can support you and guide you towards the right places to go. In the old days, actually I wasn't a rabbi in those old days when you had Rolodexes. I don't know what they're called now, it's probably a computer, or their phone, of tapping into the support system, because we've mentioned it virtually in every answer, the unbelievable chesed in the community we have here, and an unbelievable chesed in the government as well, of schemes that can be tapped into, people that can speak to, volunteer networks, charities who are there to guide people, to support people. There are lots of options out there, and I'd say the most important thing is to avoid stress as much as possible. And in a very non-rabbinic answer, something that you mentioned, Malcolm's footballing abilities right at the beginning.
Oh no, no! That was prohibited. That was forbidden,
right.
Forbidden territory. Because I'll have to speak about your ability, Rabbi. I'm afraid, if you carry on.
No, we're not going down that path. Just for the sake of openness, we play football
There's
together.
no penalties here, don't worry.
Very good.
One of the big, in and amongst the very stressful and genuinely difficult situations that people are going through, we've been blessed with unbelievable weather since this has started. So if you are stuck at home, if you must go outside once a day, take that opportunity. I mean, it's opened up a bit more. When there was one set of exercise a day you're allowed to, go for a walk, go to the nearest park, get some air, take a breather. It's important. You know, with everything going on at home, play games, fun things, but people need breaks, and recognize that you need a break, get outside, get the air. And I'm sure Malcolm will volunteer if you want to go running with him.
Talking of volunteering, I mean, we do have the Jewish Volunteering Network, and apparently the Jewish Leadership Council has set up what's called Skilled Emergency Volunteers, and is helping a number of charities to work through, and there is also an emergency fund for the community. So, you know, members of the Jewish community have stepped up. They really have done amazing work. You're so right, Rabbi Liss, that the importance of keeping positive and appreciating the amazing goodwill and good-heartedness of so many people in our community. Just a couple of very quick last questions, if I may, for Elaine. If you could possibly give us some really sort of succinct, short answers, I'm so sorry. The rights of someone who is self-isolating with mild symptoms, are they risking in any way their job by not going into work? And if someone is pregnant, do they have particular rights during this pandemic?
So starting with the individuals with mild symptoms, as long as those symptoms are of the type that are described that mean that you ought to go and get tested, there are tests nowadays for more or less everybody, or so we're told. And the first thing you do is you go and get tested. In the time that you are immediately identifying your symptoms and going getting tested and waiting for the results, you are completely protected by the legislation, except that if your employer doesn't have contractual sick pay, you might only get statutory sick pay, which is quite low at about £95.85 a week. But your job is protected at that stage. Then it depends what result you get from the test, and then you go from there. As far as pregnant workers are concerned, the advice from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has changed. I've been following it quite closely over the last 6 or 8 weeks, and now they're saying that pregnant people, whether they're in first, second or third trimester, are not any more at risk than anybody else of COVID-related illness. And they're just advising the standard self-isolation, exercise, go to work if you have to, and so on. So they're not in a separate category. As far as the law is concerned, if you're pregnant, you get uber protection, not to be treated adversely because you're pregnant, to get your job back at the end of your maternity leave, even to the point that if there's a redundancy exercise, you're coming back from maternity leave, you get first dibs on any alternative employment. It's not that it can be put out to tender basically amongst the workforce, but it's yours for the having. So lots and lots of protection for pregnant women.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can also now just thank all of you who have been listening to this, and I hope you found it helpful. I found it fascinating. I want to thank each and every one of our fantastic panelists for your words of wisdom and your explanations of some of these difficult questions at this really, really monumental time for all of us. And just to remind you all of some of the help that is out there, if you're looking for work, Work Avenue and Resource are both Jewish organizations that can help you. Looking at the Paperweight website, which has got some tremendous information that will summarize things really helpfully for you. And of course, turning, if you need to your rabbi and your community, if you need some support. You can see tonight, all of you, from the way Rabbi Liss has participated. We have so much help and wisdom and understanding in our rabbinic leaders in our community. But most particularly, my thanks must go to Bela and Benji from Paperweight for organizing this evening, and thanking all of you for joining us, for listening, and also for sending in your questions, which I hope you feel our experts have answered really helpfully. If there are more questions, please make sure that you contact Paperweight, and they will put them to our experts to see if they can answer them offline, even if it's not tonight. And may I also ask if any of you feel that you would like to support Paperweight and donate to the wonderful work of the volunteers, please do so in these difficult times. It will all be appreciated. Any donation will be greatly appreciated. But before I leave, I just want to wish all of you good health. I hope that you will all stay fit and well, and thank you again to everybody who has joined us this evening, and good night.